everybody. It's great to be here today. Thank you so much for coming. There we go. So what do you do? So this is a question that I imagine all of us get asked quite a bit. I know I do. And being in Silicon Valley, the answer is really easy. I work in tech. Because it's a company town and everybody works in tech. And so what that question is really asking is, do you work at big tech or small tech? Are you at a startup or are you at one of the big companies? So it's an interesting place to be when everybody basically is working in the same industry. But I actually got my start. My first job out of college was on Wall Street. And the answer to what do you do there is also easy. I'm a trader. I was a trader. And when you ask people that question, it's kind of funny because they'll tell you what they do, but they won't tell you what specifically they do. So you'll hear I'm a trader, but they won't tell you what they trade. They'll just try to make you think that they're really good at it. It's an interesting place to be because you get absolutely no information. You really don't connect with people on a personal level. Really, you try to gauge if they're good at what they do or not based on their watch. They're always trying to show you their watch. It's kind of a Wall Street thing. Anyway, so I was on Wall Street for 7 years as a trader, and I could answer, so what do you do, really easily, but realized I had a very hard time, increasingly over the years, answering the question, so what do you do? What is it that you do? And I worked as a trader through the financial crisis in 2008. I was still on Wall Street during the European debt crisis in 2011. And I started to feel like, I'm good at what I do, but what I did started to feel like I was playing a high-stakes poker game, right? I could do math in my head really fast. I had absolutely no idea what my tangible skills were. Didn't know how I had spent 7 years falling into a job. I went to school for computer science. Rather than becoming an engineer, I wound up on Wall Street. So I really had no idea how I had gotten there. And so when I was 30, I decided I was going to do a career reboot. And I was going to kind of go back into tech, but I felt like I was useless as an engineer. So what was left? What could I do? What would give me more of a sense of purpose? And so I went to Silicon Valley. To take a job in venture capital, because nothing says purpose like funding startups. But we joke about it now, and I think it's actually kind of a sign of how far we've come in terms of the conversation around morality in the Valley over the last 2 years. The ethics of what we build, we can, but should we? That conversation, I think, is just now beginning to take hold in the Valley. Because I remember when I moved out to do VC, it was actually treated as some sort of noble thing. Like I had left this high-paying Wall Street job behind to come help fund innovation. And I think funding innovation is actually very, very important. I think it actually is a very noble thing to do because I believe that businesses can lead. I believe that private companies can have a profound impact. It's just injecting a sense of ethics to ensure that the impact you want is the one that you're going to have. And while I was out there, I got really interested in funding hardware. I felt that hardware had been kind of underserved. We were over-indexing on apps, on social, mobile, local, on ads-based businesses. And I was really curious about whether there was an opportunity to fund innovation more in the form of a manufacturing resurgence, thinking about ways that we could give people the ability to produce products in the US, things that people really wanted. Areas where people were going to pay money to buy a device or buy a thing as opposed to funding apps that were serving ads. So I focused on hardware. And again, I spent about 3 years as a junior VC and then realized that I had begun to feel that a lot of the hardware companies I was working with were really kind of botching supply chain decisions. And that's because while there was a framework within the Valley, within the mentorship network in Silicon Valley, that could explain how you designed a product and how you marketed a product and how you got users for a product, there was very little out there for supply chain. So my real founder journey actually started at 32 when we had this idea that we were going to create a marketplace for freight. A marketplace where buyers and sellers of shipping capacity could connect, and people who had goods to ship could connect with very large companies, the carrier companies like Maersk, CMA, the behemoths that actually run the ships that move the goods from Hong Kong to the US, could be better connected and better integrated into the product design process in Silicon Valley. Now, the thing that was so key to the founder journey for me was this was an idea that I never would have had I not come from Wall Street, doing this kind of idea of injecting transparency into the market and creating a market for an underserved, inefficient space. But at the same time, I was beginning to feel like the opportunity to transform, to build a marketplace was actually what we did, but the real goal was to think bigger, to think about transforming trade. And if we could create a space where people could get the goods that they needed more cheaply. So rather than worrying about the latest Silicon Valley device maker who needed to fulfill their Kickstarter project, we started thinking in terms of shipping commodities, shipping food, shipping agricultural products, and thinking, are there ways that we can make people's lives better by fundamentally transforming trade? So around the same time, I founded my first baby. The idea for Haven kind of came about when I was on maternity leave with my son. So this was another thing. I was sitting outside enjoying the sunshine and some young people. I'm 37. I feel funny saying young people, but some guys came up to me and were talking about how entrepreneurship was a thing they were studying in college and how it was a young person's game. And I was saying, well, actually, I was already a mom, and I was 32 when my founder journey started. But I think it's important to say that so people realize that actually where I wound up going was I had the baby and I started an advocacy organization pretty much simultaneously. And that's because in Silicon Valley you have to do this thing where you put your kid on a preschool list when they're like just born. And so I started looking at the vaccination rates and realized that I did not want my child in most of the preschools in Silicon Valley because they had vaccination rates around 30%, many of them. So this was a phenomenally privileged community that does not lack for access and yet was voluntarily not using. And so myself and 2 other women responded immediately following the measles outbreak to start an advocacy organization to say that we were going to eliminate vaccine opt-outs. We were going to shut down this loophole to make our children's schools safer. We fundamentally felt that we had to change the conversation around vaccination in the Valley. And this really gave me a sense of purpose because while I was building a company that I felt did have a big idea, on a much more deep personal level, I felt this particular call, the idea that it was unconscionable that we were allowing our children to be unsafe when we had the ability to change it. So one thing that I did was my background is kind of in data science, and so I started mapping the conversation on social networks to try to gain a better understanding as we began to advance this law of why the law to eliminate vaccine opt-outs was polling at 85% positive in legislative districts, but the social network conversation was 99% negative. It was overwhelmingly negative. And this is a network analysis diagram. The little green dots over there, that's the public health and physicians' Twitter. So you can see how tiny it is. And the rest of this, the pink is anti-vax Twitter, and the aqua there was the Tea Party. And we were actually observing how the diehard California anti-vaxxers were intersecting with the Tea Partiers to try to turn this into a libertarian issue. As they were moving away from this argument that vaccines cause autism, they were moving towards this argument that the state didn't have the right to force you to vaccinate your children anyway. So this was an example kind of visualized in real time of what the conversation happening on social media, what impact that was having, and how a lot of the activity that we were seeing on social networks was manufactured. There were bots, there were coordinated accounts, there were accounts that purported to be from California but had spun up yesterday with an IP address from Texas. So there was a lot of this stuff that we were seeing where we realized that the social network conversation was fundamentally manipulated. So this, of course, as a person who worked in tech, I found this very grating, and so I started talking to friends at social platforms about it and saying, we have this problem where the conversation about our bill, which, by the way, did go on to pass and was signed into law, but this conversation is highly manipulated. What can we do about the fact that this seems to be something that is happening with increasing frequency? And the response I got back was somewhat unsatisfying. It was really, we were still at the time very much framing it in terms of free speech and not in terms of information integrity. We were still talking about whether what they were saying was true and not about the fact that we were seeing increasingly armies of bots pushing particular messages. So it doesn't matter if what they're saying is true or not. What matters is that the narrative is manipulated in terms of the sheer numbers of people engaging with the algorithms on social platforms, getting nonsense trending because they can. So around the same time, I got a call from Todd Park, the former CTO of the US at the US Digital Service, and he said, would you come down to DC for a month? the State Department is beginning to look at the way that non-state actors and violent extremists are misusing social networks, and we think that your prior work can inform this conversation. And so even though I had that young baby, it's a very hard call to refuse, and so I did go down there, and with a team of 6 people, we began to talk about what the US government could do in this fight against propaganda. And it became a little bit weird for me because I felt like I was in this room with these people who had this mission. And I thought, you know, I talk about the kind of lofty values of mission, but this was where I really felt it. And I thought, how can I keep this going? And at the time, it was difficult to figure out how to do that without actively going into government because the social network, the conversation wasn't really happening in Silicon Valley. So I started writing about this topic a lot more. I started lecturing on it. We worked on ISIS. We worked on anti-vaxxers. We worked on so many different types of actors, just trying to help the tech companies begin to understand what was happening on their platforms. Some of them actually did start to become receptive, though not really until after election 2016. But the kind of core of the experience for me was really feeling that I was able to take a skill that I had and apply it in a very purposeful way with a very sort of material, important, critical outcome that felt much more real to me than anything else that I had done to date. And then I had my second baby. and that was when my time really became an increasingly short supply. It's hard to have 2 little kids and a job and then an 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. side project investigating misinformation on social networks. And so this meant that I had to really make a choice. And it was one of the few times in life when I felt like this was the kind of culmination of decisions I had made, and I was at a crossroad where I could very comfortably answer, you know, when people would ask me, so what do you do? I would pause and I would figure out contextually, is the answer I run a supply chain logistics team at a startup that I helped found, or is it I spend my nights researching crackpots on the internet? And I decided that actually the latter was where I wanted to go. And it was interesting because, you know, as part of the founding team of the company, I felt really like, how do I step out of this gracefully? And it got me thinking a lot about, just because you found a company, is that your story? Is that the narrative that carries forward? Or can your founder story actually be that you realize that, you know, as you move from a generalist to a highly specialized role right around Series B time, maybe there is actually the right time to step out and to step into something new. So this is a saying that's actually really common in the US Digital Service. A lot of people have it on stickers on their laptops. And it really spoke to me because it made me feel that it wasn't just about what do you do. It was really how do I change my life to answer the question of what do I do? What is my goal? What is my purpose? My career is, you know, Wall Street trader, VC, founder in supply chain logistics, advisor to the government, and a number of other kind of little hats that I've worn in between, vaccine advocacy coordinator. If you've managed to follow along with the narrative over this time, I give you a lot of credit because I know that it's extremely convoluted. But what I've been thinking about lately is the fact that your career doesn't have to necessarily be a ladder. It can actually be a path. And that if you can think about what's your purpose, the answer to the question of what do you do doesn't have to be a pat answer in terms of the answer with the name of your company or the answer with your job title. For me right now, I say, I am working on the problem of information integrity on social networks. And I think that, I would encourage everybody to think kind of in those terms, not what do you do, but what is it that you do? And where is it, how can you take your talents and apply them in a way that really benefits the greatest possible number of people? So thank you very much.